right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to On the Count podcast. Great to see you. I have with me today Mark Jones and Keone Stevens. How's everybody doing?
I am doing
Okay.
excellent so far.
All right, all right. Our theme today is successfully navigating parole. And that's one of the things that is so hard when you're coming out of prison. When you come out, the first time you step out, and you have to get in touch with that parole officer. And well, I've heard good stories, and I've heard bad stories. So, Mark, walk me through what exactly. My first question: what exactly is a parole officer?
All right. I'm glad you asked. That way I wouldn't have to jump in and just kind of. Uh, it. I know we're talking to people in different states, perhaps even different countries. So the laws, the procedures, the bureaucratic or administrative setup varies from place to place, jurisdiction to jurisdiction. In the United States, over the past, I'd say this started in earnest in the 80s and the 90s. A lot of states reorganize their prison release mechanisms, if you will, and their sentencing schemes. And some states, including North Carolina, the state where I live, officially abolished parole. And what I mean by that is they abolished discretionary parole. Now, let me take people to one of the most popular prison movies in the 1990s, well, of all time, and that's The Shawshank Redemption.
Yes.
Now, we're
Yeah.
not saying that's realistic, no, we're talking about
Right.
that. But if you recall the famous scene or the scenes where Morgan Freeman goes before the parole board and answers his questions about rehabilitated, yeah, that's right there. You know, and then they, based on his prospects of the future and is he given the right answers in his prison record, they decide whether to release him. A lot of states have abandoned that method of discretionary parole, including the jurisdiction used to work for the federal government. They did away with the discretionary parole. So you don't really have so much the parole boards going into prisons and having these parole hearings. You do in some states, and you still have some people that are held over from old systems under previous sentencing schemes. Nevertheless, you still have people who are coming out of prison, and again, in a lot of states, they're either assigned to the close equivalent to parole, that being post-release supervision, or they were originally sentenced to probation after their prison time. Bottom line is, a lot of the people who come out of prison do have to report to someone, whatever that person's title may be, whatever administrative setup there may be, they have to report to someone and follow those rules. And they're subject to being visited at home, visited at work, sometimes electronic house arrest, any number of conditions might be imposed. All right, so that's what we're talking about. I just want to, because those terms get thrown around a lot very often, and the public is understandably confused about what these terms mean. The parole essentially means early release from prison. It comes from the French term parole d'honneur, which means word of honor, and it was originally used in the context of released prisoners of war, or it just meant a person's word of honor. I promise, I give you my parole, my promise that I will do such and such. So that's kind of that's where things are kind of quasi legally and administratively. Now, of course, that's not what people want to know.
Right. but
What
but it's extremely helpful that we
a
know.
little background information is all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, is there a big difference then between a parole officer and a probation officer?
No, not really. I was telling Keone before you logged on that in my former home state of Georgia, where I worked as a probation officer, he asked me some same question you asked, more or less. And there, at least at that time, administratively, there were two completely different departments, and that was just because of that's the way the government planned it. There was no real rationale for it, but they were kept completely separate. Now we would intersect sometimes. I mean, we would call each other and share information and things like that. But they worked for a distinct entity, a different entity than I did. I worked more or less for the courts, okay, and they worked more or less on another end of things, because most people that got put on probation are put on probation directly out of court. So, in other words, a person is accused of a crime and they plead guilty or are found guilty of a crime, and they are sentenced by a court. And more often than not, contrary to what the public thinks, more often than not, say 70% of the time, a judge assigns that person to probation supervision. And about 30% of the time, they are sentenced to incarceration, or what we call in North Carolina an active sentence. Of course, only a government or agency would call something an active sentence that involves sitting around doing nothing. Um, but and so, but in North Carolina, as in some other states, the two functions are combined. So you have people that have a probation caseload, they have a post-release supervision caseload. That's people that have gotten out of prison, and then we also have a few parolees who are under an old system. So all of the administrative setups may vary. Um, the function is essentially the same. The person is living in the community, is serving their sentence in the community, and they're supposed to abide by a set of rules and regulations. And if they violate them, if they're on probation and violate those rules, they go back before the judge that sentenced them. If they're on post-release supervision and violate those rules, they go before a different body. That would be the post-release supervision or the parole commission. All right. So again, administratively, there's some differences, but bottom line is that that's what they have in common. People serving a sentence in a community and have to abide by a set of rules, and if they don't, they might get locked up as a result of those violations.
So basically, you get assigned right after, as soon as they get their sentence. All right, you're going to do 180 months plus another 5 years probation. Just random. So
Yeah.
just exactly right then and there, does that probation officer get assigned to that caseload, or they might
No,
wait?
in the scenario you just described, Pedro, you're talking about a split sentence, and so the person would do their time. Now 180 months, well, that's a long time. But there are people who get long sentences. But let's say, let's just change the example just a little bit. Let's say if a person, this is a tad more common. Let's say a person gets, say, a 24-month active sentence or a 2-year active sentence, followed by a probation sentence. Now, in North Carolina, even if they do not get assigned probation at the time of sentencing, by law, they have to be supervised by somebody after they leave prison. And the rationale for that is that they thought it was not conducive to public safety, and it was not in the person's best interest if they were released from prison and had no supervision whatsoever. See, the thing that people tend to think of community corrections as probation parole as a bleeding heart thing and so forth, and some of that, but it's also about public safety too. We don't want people getting out of prison that have always had all this structure, and they may have done some bad crimes too, by the way. We don't want them getting out and having no structure, no supervision, no rules to follow. Right? So, but again, to answer your question, that officer would be assigned at the time the person is released. The
Okay.
time they actually start serving their
So,
probation sentence or post-release sentence.
how much do you know about? Because I was with Pedro trying to track when you get that caseload. How much do you know about that case when you get it? If you're getting it that late.
You mean how much does the officer know?
Yes.
Oh, well, the officer would have, now again, the vast majority of cases that probation officers supervise come directly out of court. They're not people that are released from prison. But I know that's not what we're here to talk about.
Right.
So, if the person is, say, I don't know exactly what the timeline would be, but let's say they're going to be released in, say, 3 months from today. Okay. Well, sometime before their release, their files, their information will be sent to the supervising probation office. Now, one thing that needs to be determined by the prison staff is where the person is going to be residing after they get out. Now, more often than not, they're going to be residing in the county where they were sentenced, perhaps where they're from. But there are plenty of cases in which somebody resides in one county but was sentenced in another county for a crime committed there. So the first thing that needs to be established, and this is done by prison officials, is indeed where the person is going to be living, what county they're going to be living in. And then they also need to establish what address the person is going to have. Now, very often the people you're talking about, they have burnt bridges. They're not welcome in their homes. or they have nowhere to go for other reasons. So that gets a bit dicey. So sometimes prison officials will work with, say, local probation officials, and say, look, this guy's going to get out in 2 months or whatever, where they're going to be living. And so that's when the probation office may go to work on trying to find out if there are housing options available, whether it's an Oxford house or a homeless shelter or any number of things. So they don't want to get somebody getting out of prison and being under supervision, but not having an actual residence. So that's established first. Now, in this state, again, it varies everywhere you go, all right, but in this state, it's very common for for either the sheriff, if the person is serving time in a county jail, to transport the person to their place of residence, or for probation and parole officials to go to the prison and pick that person up to take them back to the county where they're going to be living. And they can have a talk about, okay, here's what your life's going to be next for the next few months or something like that. So, that's where the supervision starts with people who are released from prison. Now, if they get put on probation by a court, that's pretty simple. You walk out of court, somebody says, okay, come here, we got some paperwork for you. Explain the conditions. All right, see you.
So that's right after that one. They got sentenced. They just got probation.
Yeah.
Okay, they got 24 months probation, 5, whatever it is. So they
Right.
automatically. But the guy that's coming out, he's inside the prison. He's done, let's say, 5, 10 years. Does he contact you, or does the file automatically come to you, and prison officials, case manager, are they put you in touch with that inmate and start working the details out? Because there's a lot of little details. It's not
Oh, yeah.
coming out, like you said. They got to have a residence. They got to have certain things in place before they even step out. I know the federal system will not let them out unless we know where they're going.
Right.
But imagine the state does the
Yeah.
same.
Yeah, and again, we're talking about 51 different jurisdictions here, and plus Puerto Rico and Guam and Virgin Islands. So 54 different jurisdictions who may do things slightly different, 54 different ways. But essentially, that's pretty much it. Again, but back in my day, though, there were people who got out, and this is a long time ago, and thank goodness some things have changed for the better. He really had nowhere to go. Now, you say that somebody has a reported residence. Well, I mean, sometimes that might be mom and dad's house, but they have no intention of staying with mom and dad.
Yeah.
Or
Or is that
they get there for a day or two and they're gone. Who knows?
Yeah.
But yeah, prison officials, though, they have to have something on paper. They call it, in this state, they call it a home plan, which just means that they know where the person's going to be living. And so they'll call the family up. They say, okay, well, I'm gonna live with my mom. Here's my mom's phone number. So they call mom up, and he says, okay, now Junior here says he's gonna be living with you after he gets out. Is that true? And mom will say yes, he's gonna be living here and so forth. Or sometimes mom and dad say, please, anywhere but here. Okay?
Yeah, sometimes they're honest. They're like, no
Well,
way.
look, a couple years ago, Keone, you remember too, Pedro, during all the George Floyd uproar, a quasi-related issue came up with people talking about, let our babies out of prison. Well, granted, there are some people who shouldn't be there, no question about that. But hold on a second now. You're saying let these people out. Well, are you ready to take care of them and have them live with you? All right, because some families aren't that keen on that person getting out, at least right away.
Hey, Mark.
So yeah, so you're talking about people in some very bad situations.
Mark, we had Hollywood James Henderson on one of the episodes, and I forgot what sentence he got, Pedro, but he was supposed to do 50 years, right?
Yeah,
And he ended up doing 18 months, and his mom works for the sheriff's office. So when she found out he was out, she called him and she said, what are you doing? How did you get out? What are you doing here? Like, he's like,
Yeah.
I'm going to call the police. She's like, Mom, they let me out. They let me out. So I get it. Before you get into some tips on successful navigation, I want to ask you, when you're reviewing a case file, what are some things that jump out at you as red flags before you even meet the person that this might be a potential problem for this person to be on parole?
Oh, good.
I know you've given
Well,
a
good.
couple.
Right. Well, good question. Well, one thing now, as you were asking, I thought, well, one thing that would jump out would be, okay, do they have a residence? Well, we know that, but do they have employment lined up? All right, but in order to reduce that subjectivity, because look, my red flags
Mhm.
might be different from yours.
Right.
Your red flags might be different from Pedro's. All right. So, what community correction agencies do is they have, it goes by different names, but a client assessment or a risk need assessment form. And that way you can quasi objectify what people's risk areas are. Because, honestly, when I'd sit in my probation office and people would come in, you can't help but do this, or we shouldn't, but we can't help but do it. And the minute somebody walks in the door, you informally kind of size them up. And all the little algorithms go off in your head, and you say to yourself, hey, this looks like a real nice person here. We're not going to have problems there. Or you say, good Lord, what a dirt bag. Okay. In order to curb that type of bias that a person may have, everyone is required to complete some sort of risk assessment form. And so that way you can determine based on their past what they have done, and also based on what answers they give you in an interview of some sort, just hopefully what kind of risk this person might be, and or what their needs might be. I mean, I recall some people that came in to visit me that seemed clean cut, they seemed middle class, okay, and were very very pleasant and so forth. But you never know what kind of what's on the inside there, because that's the way a lot of child molesters look. And it's also, people who suffer from alcohol. They're middle class alcoholics, and although they don't necessarily intend to, those can be very at risk individuals. By the same token, you'd have some guy come in with raggedy clothes and not very ill presented and so forth, and not smart or articulate. Well, they're basically okay. They just they don't present themselves very well. So you have forms and instruments that help control from that kind of bias that an individual may have.
So you have a number of questions you're going to ask them right off the bat.
Right, yeah, and let's and we're all human. I mean, there's three guys here. I guess maybe it's all men listening. I don't know, right? But let's say an attractive female comes in, all right, and so look, if you got or depending on what your sexual orientation is, an attractive person comes in, you might be swayed by that. So you want gather some sort of information, both static information. That would be things they can't change. Now, that would include their age. Race wouldn't be a factor. That would include their prior criminal history. But then you have some subjective or dynamic information, which is things that, well, let's assess this person's risk based on certain behaviors or past behaviors or what they got going on in their lives right now. And now another thing would be a risk factor would be, do they have any known gang affiliation? That's gonna crank up their risk, something like that.
Yeah, that's one thing. That's one thing we did.
I'm not going to go deep down because that's a whole nother episode. But I one of the things I'm just noting it because you said race is not a factor, and I always say this.
Officially, it's not a factor.
No. But what you're saying is correct. Policies, instruments are used by humans, and then that's where it goes wrong. And
exactly.
Someone like you. I know you. Someone like you and Pedro, it's not a factor. We know there's people out there that use that as a factor. But like you were saying earlier, it doesn't matter about their predisposition, their race, their gender, their height, their weight, all that stuff. If people are using the instruments properly, then the bias is not there.
Well, yeah, but John, there's still, as you said, there's still subjectivity, and it's a human being, using an instrument. And I'll say, you know me now, but you didn't know me when I was in my 20s. Now, I'm not saying that I rated a person higher or lower based on their race, but I would sometimes be more subjective when it came just kind of a general overall impression. And like as I said, sometimes a person walked in, you just say, look, this person just looks like trouble, or perhaps they just have an unpleasant personality, but conversely, it may have a very winning personality where they're conning you.
Well, you also evolved. So I mean, that's your early 20s. You also evolved. Some people don't evolve. You also evolved. So
yeah, of course. Yeah.
Most people.
But I'm not saying even if I were doing it now, I'd make mistakes now. I'd make misjudgments, of course.
Oh, that's just a natural thing, right?
Well, one of the age-old problems in criminal justice, and almost all officials in the criminal justice system have to deal with this, is what I've heard called the prediction problem, and trying to predict what people are going to do. I mean, judges and prosecutors, even people in law enforcement, and then people in probation and parole, and a lot of other criminal justice positions. They're in the business of trying to predict what people are going to do, and the best way to do that is using their past behavior as a guide. But that's a very imperfect way of doing it.
Right, especially if you're not considering. I see so many people go, "Well, he has a criminal past." Yeah, when he was 22, he's
Yeah,
57 now. He hasn't
yeah,
done anything in 30 something years.
right.
What are you bringing up his criminal past
Well,
for?
as you say that, I have one old guy that I had. I can tell war stories here till I'm blue in the face, but I recall a guy once who was older than 57. I think he was like in his 70s, which of course to me at that time was like 130. All right,
Mhm.
but nevertheless he was old even for that age. Now he had an extensive criminal record from a long, long, long time back, but he had gone a long time without any kind of trouble. But then he gets into some trouble. All right. So now, what kind of a risk factor is this guy? All right. I mean, yeah, he had an extensive criminal history going back to his teens and his 20s, and then he kind of went dormant for about 30 or 40 years, and all of a sudden he pulls a gun on somebody. But the guy could barely make it to the courthouse. I finally told him. I said, "Look, I'll make a deal with you. You don't get arrested, all right, and you don't have to report anymore because I'm afraid you're going to conk out and die of a heart attack while you're walking to come and see me." So I said, "You're still on probation, all right, and if you F up, I'm going to come get you, but don't worry about reporting." All right. So, but a judgment call. The guy may go out next month and kill somebody, for all I know.
It is a judgment call. You just remind me of I got a guy come in and he's about his 70s and he's from New York. And I start reading his file. This guy is, he's been in and out of prison. He actually is a member of one of the families out of New York. And I
Oh,
look
yeah.
at I look at this guy and I look at it at the time. He's 70 years old, about to turn 70, 69, 70 years old, and his look in his eyes is one of those that if you cross me today, I will still kill you. I'm like,
Yeah.
that's my conversation, and I'm talking to this guy, which it changed later on, but my first impression was that I'm like, in the back of my head, I'm interviewing him, and I'm thinking, wow, this guy is 70 years old, but I can still tell that he is so willing for anything. If anything goes wrong, he just is
Well,
no qualm to kill you.
you mentioned that, Pedro, and that's interesting because it reminded me of a project I did some years back. There are certain people in certain areas of crime that never retire. Okay, and one of those would be first off would be pedophiles. A person does not get to a certain age, so well, okay, I don't want to molest kids anymore. All right. Some of my older offenders, my older probationers, were elderly men on probation for child molestation. And in some cases, these guys have probably been molesting kids for like 60 years and finally got caught. It's just they finally molested the wrong person, the person who was not a family member, and they finally snitched on them. All right. But in the case of the person you're talking about, I did a project about 20 years ago with probation officials with the U.S. probation department in the Eastern District of New York, which is Brooklyn and Long Island. And they had those guys you're talking about on their caseload. Okay. And yet some of those guys, they still had the fire in the belly. And as long as they lived, they were members of those families you're talking about. And no, they did not, some people do not age out. We say in criminal justice all the time. Most offenders, or a lot of offenders, they eventually age out. Once they hit the age of, say, 30 to 35, they finally calm down. And if they haven't ruined their life beyond redemption at that point, they're going to be okay. But not
Well,
everyone.
yeah, I mean, that same guy, I did see him for several years. He was on my caseload, and he was there about 4 years. He got cancer, and he was really, really sick. And he came to me and talked to me because for whatever reason, all the Italian guys came and spoke to me. It didn't matter whether they were in my caseload or not. And even the warden one time, can you get all these guys together because they're disrupting? I had this whole meeting with all the Italian guys. They always respected me. But when I saw him about 4 years later and we were talking, he came and talked to me and he gave me, about what he had going on. I could see that the fire in his eyes was gone.
Yeah.
it was just totally different look. I've never that's a look that just could never I've never gotten out of my head. The look on his face when I first met him, his eyes, is not his face, is what I could see in his eyes.
Well,
You know,
the
the
window to the
difference.
soul.
Yeah, when I saw him, when noticed him later on, 4 years later, when he was really sick, it was a totally different view on his eyes.
Well,
When you,
I remember one. This
Mark,
was
when you're talking about the guys that you see, whether that's Pedro in prison or Mark when they were on parole, and you see those guys that you just know they're not going to stop being a criminal. Is that where the phrase was coined, hardened criminal? Or what's the phrase for that? Like when you just see
there's
that
no
guy
hard and
that's
fast.
not, huh?
Yeah, there's no hard and fast definition. I mean, um,
Mm,
and that's just a wildly subjective term. But the court system tries to define what a repeat or habitual offender is,
Hmm.
and again, it's somewhat arbitrary. I mean, there are kinds of laws that were popular back in the '90s called three strikes and you're outlaws, where if you got say three felony convictions, you automatically got a life sentence or like a 20-year add-on to the next crime you committed, that type of thing. Well, look, that's subjective because I couldn't help but think that what if what if baseball had not changed its rule back in the 19th century and a person was out on four strikes instead of three? How that might change sentencing schemes. So we just say three strikes. It's just sort of nice, something that resonates with us. But why three? I don't know. Um, but again, it's a very inexact science.
right.
And then on top of that, it's politically charged, um, and you have politicians making decisions based on what they think their constituency wants them to do, and that's the way it is in a democracy. But there's also a downside to it too. We don't pay very much attention to so-called social scientific evidence, and politics drives criminal justice policy more so than science does.
It does, and I think when you refer to science, what I know it kind of changes, it fluctuates a lot. About every 20 years, somebody comes and fluctuates. What is it? What makes a criminal? What is behind
Yeah.
it? So it kind of fluctuates in the way we look at it every 20 years. I've noticed that by reading and
Oh, it's cyclical. Yeah, and I say science, and I should use air quotes when I say that because um, a person who engages in research in the natural sciences, in the hard sciences, in medical sciences, things like that, they kind of scoff at the term social science anyway. Um, and you also have to remember that. Look, John talked about the human beings, use the instruments. Well, human beings do the scientific research too, and academics and social science researchers, they very often have an agenda of their own, or they have a bias one way or the other themselves. So there's really no such thing as really objective social science in this area, and it's why, quite frankly, I don't. With all given my 30 some odd years doing this stuff, I really can't say that I don't that criminal justice social science research has really had that big of an impact, and I'm not sure that's always a bad thing. I've seen some things that are very popular out there that I thought this may look good on paper, it may look good to you, but it's not very good science. Or sometimes a social science research project comes out that fits a particular agenda, and then they run with it. Okay, now I mean, for example, um, this is unrelated to parole, but say domestic violence. I mean, for a long time, when it came to domestic violence, police officers would get to the scene and they'd separate the parties and say, okay, look, you try to get along and so forth, and they'd leave. Well, then some research came out in the '80s that suggested that making an arrest in a DV situation, it does improve safety. All right, no, it's a good thing. That was one study, and then policymakers took that and ran with it. All right, because it suited the agenda of that time. But subsequent research has come along to say, look, that may not be necessary or might not be a good idea. But if it conforms to a certain political agenda that's being driven by one party or the other, it might get put into play.
what makes people happy at the time.
Right? Yeah.
The,
Well,
the,
back in the
the
'90s,
war on
it was
drugs.
get tough, and now
Well,
the pendulum has swung this way, and
it's
now we're back to rehabilitating people.
it's what makes
Right.
people happy, and it's also what's the best illusion that I can give you that makes you feel safe or that things are happening. I mean, Pedro, you threw in the war on drugs, and I remember watching this documentary, watching the amounts of dollars spent on stopping marijuana, and it was extremely higher than heroin and
Yeah.
prescription pills and crack and coke. I'm like, so the least harmless of the drugs, you spent
Well,
the
look, John,
most on it.
I can break that down. I'm
Yeah.
glad you mentioned. I can break that down on a much more localized level because I'm sure
Mhm.
you're looking at something that was, national in scope and whatnot.
Yeah.
But in the county where I served as a probation officer, a small county in
Mhm.
Georgia, the sheriff took it upon himself. I'm not being that overly critical here, but they wanted to, go after drug dealers in the county,
Mhm.
and they brought in some undercover agents, one from the GBI, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and also, well, they borrowed some agents out of the county for obvious reasons. If they want to be undercover, and they went around for several months making drug buys, identifying drug dealers. All right, and then they came out from undercover, whole bunch of indictments, and then they had a week set aside to try some of these guys,
Mhm.
and the jury acquitted every one of them. And it didn't matter what the variable was. It didn't matter as far as race goes. They acquitted black defendants, white defendants, where there were either white police officers, black police officers. The juries were mixed race. It's just there was something that took hold in that jury pool, and they engaged in a behavior that's known as jury nullification. And they more or less just said, yes, they were guilty, all right, but we don't like what the sheriff did, and we're going to turn these people loose. And that's what happened. And what they were going after essentially was people who were out there selling marijuana. The members of that jury pool just didn't think it was very important, and so they turned these guys loose,
Mhm.
even though they were guilty. There's not much question about that.
It wasn't a question of being guilty. It's just the procedure they went through. It's just like, okay, that was questionable how they did the
Well,
whole
it's jury nullification. I mean, and some people suggest. I mean, the O.J. Simpson case was turned inside out every which way you can back in the '90s, as to why he was acquitted. Well, one of the explanations put forward was that the jurors tended to overlook the actual facts of the case, and may have issued that verdict, or some of them may have issued that verdict as a protest against what they believe to be improper police actions. Now, of course, that's all speculation. We don't know. All right, but
No,
that's jury nullification.
it's speculation, but you can see it. You can see it just being a human. You can see
Yeah.
some people getting fed up, and you go, you know what? I don't care what happens. Screw it. This
Yeah.
wasn't done right.
Well,
And
the case I just referred to that about the marijuana, there was no question that was what was happening because there was no
Mhm.
question really about these guys' guilt. But it's
Yeah.
just that that's what this jury did.
All
wow.
right. So
Um,
let's. Oh, go ahead, Pedro.
no, go ahead, Keone. I'm going to ask him a question, but go ahead.
No, no, go ahead, because I was going to get back to the navigating through parole. But go ahead.
Yeah, that's one of the things I pretty much, and that's where I want to go
I
by.
hope some poor slob out there writing all this stuff down.
Well, hey,
Um,
that's how conversations work. Sometimes a point gets brought up, and sometimes I don't like to just make a point and then we just gloss over it and go a different way. Some people might have a question of, wait, what does that mean? Or why did you say that? Or why did you challenge that? Or, follow up on that response, that remark. So it's all
yeah,
good.
it's all good. Um, right, what you think when you start looking at the case? What you, and I think Keone kind of referred a little bit to it.
I want to know. I
What is,
really
what
want
is a
to ask him, Pedro,
successful?
like, what's Mark's procedure, like
I
his
want, yeah.
routine when he
What
gets
is
a
the
case.
procedure? What gets you in that? Well, this is going to
Yeah.
be a successful, reentry, or this is not going to work.
Well,
Yeah.
you look
What are we
for
checking?
again, and I hate to keep coming back to that form I talked about, but that does
Mhm.
help guide you. You look for those risk factors, and in my opinion, the two of the biggest risk factors, and some agencies recognize this as such, and others don't. Is one, does the person have an addiction?
Mhm.
Because you can offer all the advice you want about how to succeed on parole or anything else, but if that person has an addiction, a drug addiction, no words can help. There's no secret to navigating that. And the other one would be, does the person have mental health issues? Because there you're talking about something that a person sitting in their office can't control or deal with or manage. Um, so those are the two biggest risk factors. I say over and over again that if there were such a thing as a cure for addiction, and if mental illness did not exist, which I know is like pushing at the ocean, it's not even possible. then the criminal justice system would almost be out of business. All right, you still have a few white collar crooks out there and a few people that sex offenders and whatnot, but those to me those are the two biggest risk factors. Now, another thing that gets factored in here is age. All right, so if usually if a person was convicted of the first crime and they're under the age of say 20 or 18, they're more likely to be at risk than someone who does their first crime at say 30 or 35. So age is a factor as well. Well, other than that, it's pretty highly individualistic, because there's no two people are alike, and say gang affiliation is almost a dead giveaway for some officers. That was something that wasn't as much of a factor when I was in probation as it is now, as it became later on.
All right, gang affiliation is tough, but like Keone said, that'll be another subject we will touch on later on in gang affiliations.
Well, I had a friend who was a parole officer, and you guys have the ability. Well, I don't want to speak like I'm the expert, Mark. You could probably explain it. There are times where you can authorize someone to live outside of where they were paroled. And
Yes.
he liked when he had people who were gang affiliated and they wanted to move away.
Right.
Like, he didn't want them to sit in that same area at an address and be paroled there. If they wanted to go 300 and 400 miles away, he worked hard to get them away.
Probably a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's also showing that person doesn't want to go back to that.
Exactly. Well, again, it's so individualistic. I mean, where should a person live when they get out or when they're in a sentence? Now, in some cases, they're better off going back to, the wife, the husband, the mother and dad. But in a lot of those cases, that means they're going to go back to the same neighborhood and associate with the same people that helped them in trouble in the first place. Conversely, there are people who should do that. That's the best place for them. So, it depends on the individual.
So there's no standard.
Yeah.
No.
Do you have to do any counseling? Like, do you consider yourself a counselor, or is it, how deep do you get into that?
That depends, all right, because in my day, and if a person has high caseloads, there are a few reasons why the individual officer does not become a quote unquote counselor, as you were indicating. For one thing, they don't have the time, and so if you're just struggling to keep up with the paperwork and keep up with crossing the I's, crossing the T's and dotting the I's to get by, you don't have time for that. But the other reason, Keone, that you don't want that sometimes, well, what's more common in community corrections is what's called the brokerage model, and that way you don't do the counseling yourself because you don't have the time and you don't have the expertise, by the way, but you refer them to resources in that area. Let's say, you have a person with a bachelor's degree in criminal justice. They're not a psychologist. They shouldn't be trying to do that kind of intervention, but they should mandate that person seek the proper treatment, as the case may be, whether it's A&D counseling or any number of other things, and that they monitor their compliance. So in other words, I'm a probation officer. I'm going to make you go to seek mental health counseling because I don't have the time or expertise to do it myself. But I'm going to make sure that you go, and if you don't, then I'm going to come down on you. I had a guy once who had severe mental health issues, and he thought that he could get off his medication and be okay. I was able to reason with the guy enough to say, look, you need medication, you need counseling, and if you don't go back, I'm going to get a warrant and put you in jail. And he went back, and he's one of the few people I had to come and thank me later on for probably saving his life by making him do that. But another thing, though, is that you say you don't have the expertise. I got a guy pissed off, quite frankly, at me once because I overheard him talking on the phone, and he was talking about one of his probationers, and he told somebody over the phone that this guy had every identifiable trait of a psychopath. Okay, the guy talking on the phone had a bachelor's degree in public administration. He didn't know what the hell a psychopath was, other than just seeing stuff on TV like the rest of us did, seeing Red Dragon or whatever.
Right.
And I kidded him about that. I called him, his last name was Bridges. I said, listen to Dr. Bridges over there. I made the mistake of kidding in front of the boss. He didn't take very kindly to that. But I was just kidding, but I didn't regret it because I was saying to myself, I'm a big fan of the Andy Griffith Show from the 60s. And when Barney Fife would try to engage in amateur psychology with people, They do more harm than good. So you don't have the expertise. And the other thing is, Keone, with a counselor, a person who does therapeutic work like that, you got to remember that if you're a probation officer, you may have to do something unpleasant one of these days, and you don't want that person confiding in you, all right? And because there's a role conflict there. Are you their advocate or are you the law enforcer? Because if they start talking about stuff, they may not feel comfortable talking with you because they say, look, I'm going to pour out my heart to this guy, and then one day you may take a warrant for me. So there's that role conflict that goes on as well.
It's a fine line. They're trying to help and just being, you're there to guide them and put them in the right direction, but you're not there to be their pal and friend. And
there are other people that do that. I mean, and there's a place for that, but you walk a very fine line. But there are some people who are specialized in certain areas that work for probation parole agencies, and they're equipped, trained to do that. But for the most part, though, you have a person walk around with, say, with a bachelor's degree in criminal justice or sociology or what have you. They don't have the qualifications or the time, and they may have a role conflict that prohibits them from being a good therapeutic agent like you're talking about.
Yeah, we had psychologists on board and all that we send them to and let them do all that evaluating. But right. They always when I was an officer, a lot of them will ask about the behavior. What kind of behavior do you see anything different? What is it? They always ask our opinion as well on how was that or what you feel, because they like to know what is it we see. Because the thing about a lot of inmates, and you probably agree with me, they know how to answer these set questions. They know how to give you all the right answers when they are in that environment. For us, they know how to answer those questions, but they're not being truthful. They just know how to answer. Then it
works all kind of ways, Pedro. I remember my limited experience in the Georgia prison system was not as an officer or a counselor. It was as a recreation supervisor of all things, which I don't think these positions even exist anymore. So they tended to interact. I say they tended to, unless I'm being careful here, they tended to interact a little differently with me than they did a guy in your position or these officers, because they saw the officers as cops, okay, and they saw the counselors as people who wanted to hear a certain thing and would help them someday. But I recall, one guy a couple guys come to my mind. There's one guy, he would say this in front of me, but not in front of anybody else. He would say, "I can't wait to get out and start using cocaine again." Another guy said, he was in for forgery. He said, "I can't wait to get out and start writing checks again." Okay, they wouldn't say that to an officer, and they wouldn't say that to a counselor, because a counselor, if they hear something like that, even a therapeutic agent like a counselor, you're gonna write that down and send that. It's going to be part of their record. What they said to me was not part of the record, if you will, and people know that. If you develop the proper antenna, get that on your still think of that, John.
And actually, it helps. It helps out in the long run.
That's funny. The answering, knowing the answers to the test. That's why a lot of psychological tests, no matter how rudimentary they are or advanced they are, they tend to ask the same question several different ways. Yeah. Because it's like, you've answered this question 8 times and you didn't know it. You've answered it 8 different ways. That could be the same answer.
But some of them are very, very good at answering these questions. They know what is the answer or how to answer them and how to manipulate the psychologist. Yeah. They're really good. I mean, you get guys that are very charismatic and good at talking to people. They're good at it. That's what they do. I mean,
and they aren't necessarily the kind of people you're talking about, Pedro. They're not necessarily the most educated either, but they've got good street education. You don't have to have a 4-year degree or a master's degree to be a good con man or con woman.
Well, I think, like you brought up the movie Shawshank Redemption, I think when they show parole boards in movies and TV shows, it's always these basic questions. Well, are you going to commit a crime again? What's the person going to say? Yes. It's like, no.
Well, the way that scene starts out with is the guy says to Morgan Freeman, Do you think you've been rehabilitated? No one would ever start out a hearing with a question like that. But it was great for the movie, wasn't it? Okay.
Right. So it's like I know parole boards don't work like that, where they just ask like six basic questions that you can just say yes to, and then send you on your way.
Well,
And I do know sometimes without even being there, there's sometimes someone's coming up from parole. You could say it's conspiracy. I know everyone in that room is like, I don't care what the answer is. We're not paroling this dirt bag.
yeah. Well, look, I mean, and sometimes I have, in some of the classes I've taught, I've gotten hold of documentaries that examine
Hmm.
parole in action. Okay, and then I'd stop and I'd say, okay, now look, listen, you heard what the board had to say. You were told about the person's offense and their prior history and so forth. So you have about as much information as they do. Now, what would you do? Would you parole a person, yes or no? And then some hands go up, some don't. Well, what's interesting though, and this is what you described, is that in some cases, the officials will try to ascertain what they think the person will do in the future. All right, but in some cases, that doesn't matter. You know, what matters is that the crime you committed was so bad, and your record is so bad. It doesn't matter what you say. We're going to keep you locked up. I mean, if Charles Manson, for example, if you ever saw Charles Manson's parole hearings, just don't treat yourself and watch a couple of them. If that guy had, no matter what he was not going to get paroled. Okay, and they were just going through the motions. And so there are plenty of much more low profile cases like that.
Hmm.
And in that case, they're punishing the person not for what they might do in the future, but for what they've already done. Now, which is right?
Yeah, I know.
That's why they call it case by case basis.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I had a guy that he was on the old system, and he had murdered his wife in the Air Force Base here in North Carolina. They actually made a movie of him and what he did and everything.
Oh, Jeffrey
But his
Dahmer,
I can't think of his name. Yeah,
the fatal vision murder, Jeffrey McDonald.
no, it was somebody else.
Okay,
I
he
can't think
killed his
of.
wife and his kids, by the way.
No, he this guy killed his wife, and he hit her in a drum and put her away. And
Okay,
but every time he came out for parole, his kids would show up, and they had it that the judge, I think, had left it. Every time he comes for parole, they were to come in and give you, and they would say no, we don't want him out. And
yeah,
some other
yeah.
people just came in the community and said no.
Well, so that brings up another point. How much input should a victim have, or how much input should a person with a vested interest? How much input should they have? I
Right,
always
because if you're a
say,
victim, you like if you killed someone close to me, I'm never getting over it. I might get over it emotionally, but I'm never gonna get over it as pertaining to you. So if I go to every single one of your parole hearings for the next 50 years, the answer is no.
see that's your reaction. And see,
Right.
and I always tell people, I do this sometimes with my students. I would say, okay, now suppose that someone would have killed someone you love, your
Hmm.
sister, your brother, your mother, father, whatever. What would you want to happen to them? And you'll find that answers are all over the place.
Hmm.
Some people would be forgiving. Some would say eye for an eye. Some would say they didn't really care. It wasn't their problem. And that's why I say that we got to be very careful how much credence we should give to the thoughts or feelings of loved ones in situations like this, because they're too emotionally invested. And this is why also when we say a person commits a crime, we don't say like it's like if I were to assault John, we don't say it's Jones versus Stevens. We say it's the state versus Jones, because the
Hmm.
crime that I committed is a crime against everybody, not just Keone Stevens.
I always wondered that.
Oh,
Why you did that? You just cleared
And
that up.
John's not the first person I would try to assault, by the way. He's a pretty,
What? I'm a teddy bear. Come
he's a
on,
pretty big, no, he's a pretty big guy from Miami, Florida. So I'm not going to mess with
I'm a
you.
teddy bear. Come on. God, I can't fight. Uh, so, so let's talk about successfully navigating yourself through parole. I want to get some tips from Mark for anyone who's going out there on parole. What are some? I know everything's going to be specific based
Of
on
course.
the length of parole, but what are some of the basic tips you try to that you would give to someone?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is don't try to outsmart your parole officer. I mean, try your best to go. I know this sounds elementary, but as it is, but there are certain people who go through life and try to go through on the outside. They try to go through on the rim. Instead, go right down the middle. Uh, don't try to con your way out of things. Don't bullshit your probation officer. Even the most even a novice probation officer, although they get fooled sometimes, we all do. They can smell bullshit a mile away. So uh, don't try to con anybody. Now, beyond that, it's very highly individualistic because it's easy to sit here and say, "Hey, look, get a job, don't drink, don't do drugs," but sometimes those are very difficult things to do. If a person has an addiction, of course, that's extremely difficult, and sometimes getting a job is not as easy for some people under supervision as others. Sometimes you're formally excluded because of a law says you can't hold certain jobs. Um, and sometimes a lot of folks you're talking about don't have that many skills anyway. Sometimes transportation is an issue. Securing transportation is a big thing. I would say that don't hesitate and don't make your probation officer make you have to reach out for assistance because more and more communities, including here in Pitt County, have agencies that are devoted to assisting people who are being released from incarceration. So they're not everywhere, especially in small rural counties. But like, for example, in Charlotte, North Carolina, it's an excellent agency. It's a nonprofit, but they deal with people. They try to help people readjust or improve people who have what they call people with records. That's people who are getting out of prison or people who have a long criminal record and are trying to navigate things like establishing credit, getting a job, et cetera, paying the bills, that type of thing. Look for those things. Be proactive in doing stuff like that. Other than that, like I said, I hope some poor slobs are writing all this stuff down, thinking I have all the answers because I do not. But that's just some things that come to mind.
Okay, and I imagine training. I know before coming out of prison, we do offer the certain classes and trying to get them ready to come out and be proactive. A lot of them are not. Some of them are. I know I've told Keone, I usually had a set of questions that I would ask before being released because I will be the one to sign them out, go walk them out before they left the institution. And
Yeah.
and you were talking about work, and that's one of the questions I would ask. I ask them about work. What are you going to do when you get out? What is the work? And a lot of times, when they tell me, um, well, my dad, my mom, my friend, well, they have a job for me and they're going to help me. This is what they got. And it was like, there is no consistency. When I started
Yeah.
seeing, that's one of those that always got me, the job thing. And they really didn't know. They expected somebody to help them out. Well, I know this is going to help me get this, but um,
Well, in
that
some
was,
cases they don't know. They're locked up. How are they going to know? They
but
haven't applied anywhere.
But then you had other guys that really they were sending out resumes. By the time they got out, they already had a job line. Hey, well, this company already have me waiting.
Yeah.
This is what I'm going to do. I talked to a couple other guys. Yeah, they had it lined up and they worked for that company for a few months and it didn't work out. Some of them did, some of them didn't. But I thought that was one of the main things that I could use to gauge and start using that as a gauge. Yeah, you do have a job lined up. What is it you have going on? The other
Yeah.
thing I always told them is that I use for gauge is how much amount. What did you do? Did you save money while you were here? Did you spend all the money you spent 5 years, 10 years? How much money you have saved up? Oh, I just got like $100, $200 and whatever they're gonna give me. And my mom and my family's going, and I'll be like, oh my God, you expected
Yeah.
people to help you, and I'm like, that's not gonna work.
Well,
Um,
yeah, and sometimes even if they have an identifiable support system, it doesn't mean it's going to follow through. Um, it's very difficult. But then again, you remember, Pedro, those people have been locked up. How much can they do from the inside? And plus, you work for the federal system, and the federal system probably does as good a job as any, perhaps better than any jurisdiction in the country on things like that, on offering those courses, on preparing people for life on the outside. Here in North Carolina, there are no transition centers that the state operates, so they're released cold onto the street as opposed to going through like a halfway house before they get out totally. Um, and there's no really move of foot to do that. If you have people who serve time in county jails, they don't get any of those classes, any of that stuff you're talking. They just sit and warehouse them. So we we don't do very much, quite frankly. I don't think there's a big move because the conservatives out there want to keep them locked up. We don't care. Look, if you don't, don't complain about your conditions. Don't if you don't do the if you can't do the time, don't do the crime, that type of thing. You got that attitude. The liberals are just as bad when they say that, well, all your problems are traceable to something else, and we should let everyone out. That doesn't help either. All right.
No.
What when I dealt with people that walked into my office, it wasn't doing it good to say, kill them all and let God sort them out. It also wasn't doing it good to have them lay even though there may be some truth to it, to blame their problems on somebody or something else. I got this one person in front of me, but what am I going to do to help this person, to keep this person from having to go back and get in further trouble?
I think the one thing sometimes people confuse is it's not blaming circumstances and all of that. But I think sometimes what people miss is just the understanding part. Like, even from being a coach, I can see someone that has a series of problems that have led to where they are now. I don't let them use that as an excuse, but I
Yeah,
can understand why they are where they are. And that in terms helps me deal with them better. I think a lot of
yeah.
people mistake understanding their circumstances for, oh, you're using as an excuse. No, I'm saying
You're
I
right. Yeah,
understand,
yeah,
why this person ended up like that. And this is what helps me help them better,
yeah.
you know?
Good points. Yeah,
Yeah, to me, that understanding also came. I always made the difference because everybody's a little bit different. You can't. I learned that the guy that came from up north, New York, Boston, has not the same train of thought or how they look at things. The same guy that comes from Mississippi or
Oh,
somewhere in
I
the
meant
East
more
Coast.
like this. What I noticed, and I didn't do some social experience, but what I noticed from, sometimes we do social experience experiment. We don't always get in a controlled room, right? We just use life, right? And from where I grew up as a
especially now.
kid, observations from as a teenager and adult, what I've noticed with most people that I've known that have, let's say, grown up in a home where the dad abuses the mom, I noticed one or two things. They have normally become abusers themselves, or they have a profound love of women because they saw what their mom went through. I never really see the in between effect. And that's kind of what I mean. Not, I get the like, but that's kind of what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Is noticing how did you at 30 not know not to smack your wife upside the head, and then I look at the past history of this person and how they got to where they are. And I'm just saying that helps me talk to them better and things like that, but
Well,
not
I
use
mean,
it as an
I
excuse.
dealt with people who could barely read and write or couldn't read and
Mhm.
write, who were at the age of adulthood was 17 in those days in Georgia. Let's say they're 17 years old. You run the gamut from somebody like that to somebody in their 50s who has an advanced degree, and it's difficult. You walk a fine line between, talking to someone, where they are in life, and between that and being overly deferential or overly critical of someone. So it's hard to treat people different, but at the same time treat them equally, and not give preference to one or the other. So that's another fine line you walk there too. You might find yourself unconsciously being deferential to someone who's more educated, and leaning harder on someone who is not. But again, we're human, and that's why there's
Right.
some measures put in place that try to control that type of thing.
Hmm.
So did you make that difference?
I'm
How
not
you
sure I always did successfully, quite
okay.
frankly.
Hmm.
I mean,
Yeah, Mark's being very open. He's not making it like, hey, I made all of the right decisions
oh my
and went
goodness,
straight
no.
by the book, and
Yeah.
everyone that I had on parole, I did, extremely just by. Yeah, he's
Oh
very
yeah, no, no
honest
question about it. No,
about
I screwed up a lot. I don't think that I ever, because there are enough mechanisms in place to where, look, I never revoked somebody's probation. Okay, before it got to that point, it had to go through me. It had to go through a prosecutor. It had to go through a judge, and the judge made the ultimate decision. So there was that safeguard in line, and so I never regretted. I never did anything illegal, put it that way, or extra legal. But that I always used the best judgment and talk to people the right way. No, of course not. No, I
Well,
didn't.
just by
It,
knowing you, Mark, I think even when just by knowing you, even not knowing you back then, but I even think even with the mistakes you made, I could probably put my money on it that they didn't come from a place of malice. or there was no, ill intent,
You had to be careful about that because I
Mhm.
recall one guy, and this is a young white kid. I don't know what this guy's thinking was, but for some reason he thought the best thing to do is to walk into the office with a probation officer the first time and be as obnoxious and as rude as possible. Did I take it personally? Of course I did. Okay, and I increased his reporting requirements. Okay, and within a month he was eating out of my hand. But did I use personal malice to make that guy report a little more? Well, is it personal malice, or was it
Yeah.
justified because of this guy's
Well,
disposition?
you know what I mean by malice.
I know exactly what you mean, and
Yeah.
sometimes
I don't think you did
but
anything out of hate or ill intent, like purposely trying to screw. Hey, somebody wants to
no,
be a jerk, so you give them higher standards. It's not really malice to me. You
yeah,
know.
my
You,
well, yeah, and my
yeah.
attitude also was, and he had to adopt this attitude.
Yeah.
If a person is determined to mess up,
Yeah.
don't help them out. Just give them the rope;
Yeah.
they'll do it themselves.
There's just certain things in life and Mark you should know to do. You don't insult your waiter or waitress before you get your food. Like there's
Yeah,
just certain things you don't do.
yeah.
No, that's not a good idea.
And I'm
And
going to Capitol Grill, by the way,
yeah,
tonight too. So
and when you get out, yeah, that's a good tip.
All
Do
right, Pedro.
not do not piss off your probation officer.
This has been a
don't
good
piss in your own
episode.
canteen.
No, don't do that.
Yeah,
Don't do
don't
not
fart in your own
have him on
spacesuit.
your side as much as possible. That is one of the biggest tips. He can help you out, or he can make your life miserable, just like being in prison. But um, Mark, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for being
Yeah,
here today,
enjoy.
and just being honest and blunt about uh, the things that happen. I really appreciate that. I know Keone does as well. Keone, you got any last words? Anything?
No, I don't.
All right, so that's
I
great.
I don't have any more. I can ask Mark questions all day long. So
Yeah,
for right now, I don't have any more questions. Hey, he's been on here what 2 or 3 times. He's going to be on here
yeah,
more. So
and I'm sure he'll
we'll
be
have
back.
plenty of questions for him. Uh, just yeah.
Okay,
I'm
well,
sure we'll have Mark back anyway. Um, so thank you again, Mark. Thank you, Keone. Thank you all that are watching. And all I'm going to say is, listen, if y'all want to join us, anything that you want to share with us, also you can contact us at onthecount.podcast@gmail.com. And we will love to have some other people come in and talk to us and share your past or anything that has happened, if you come out of prison, or if you work in the prison system, we would love to have you on. That is all what we have today for On the Count. It's been great seeing you all. Thank you so much. We got some more coming on. So have a great rest of your day. Thank you, Keone. Thank you, Mark. Have a great rest of your evening.